a great opportunity to ask you your testimony. I've read many of your articles and your work, and I'm pretty sure that many people in Latin America that are very concerned with what's going on, and they are trying to grapple with this whole idea. All of a sudden, they've been dumped in Latin America. They are trying to implement a whole new curriculum on gender ideology that is not presented just as a course that you can take, that might be optional or not, like in Canada, where parents can pull their children out. But in Argentina, they made it in such a way that it's incorporated in every single subject. So that it's impossible for parents or for children to run away from any kind of ideology or and so tell me if you don't mind a little bit about your story, because I think it's a very powerful testimony.
Yeah, thank you. Well, as you probably know, what I bring to this discussion is 73 years of firsthand experience with it. And because I started at the age of 4, cross-dressing, being affirmed, which is probably the most dangerous thing you can do to young children, is affirm them in a cross-gender identity. Because the second you affirm a young child at 4, 5, 6, or 10, or whatever age, is that what you're really saying to them is that there's something wrong with who they really are, and that they need to do something else to become okay, which is totally false. The other thing that's interesting that I've learned over those 73 years is that when we have not only affirming people how destructive it is, but what we've done is we've conflated the idea of gender curiosity with gender dysphoria. And so it's quite natural for young people to have a curiosity about gender. What isn't natural is for adults to conflate that and say, oh, that's gender dysphoria, we need to affirm you. So, in the old days, kids were curious about gender, but parents never affirmed them. This is a whole new political ideology that's been pushed upon societies around the world, which is why we see so many people thinking that they should adopt a different gender identity. And so once that seed is planted, the seed of affirmation, which turns into dysphoria, confusion, something's wrong with me. In my own life, that just started 4, 5, 6, 7. And then at the age of 7 or 8, I was sexually molested by an uncle. So that sort of cements within your psyche something is really wrong with you. And it's so destructive. And most of the people that I work with today, I would say 50 to 60% of them have been sexually or emotionally abused as young people. And so that also causes them to think there's something wrong with them. And so they actually just don't want to be who they are and begin to adopt the idea, I need to become somebody else so that I don't have to feel this pain. So I lived throughout that, this started for me in 1944. So it was a long time. They didn't have the words. Mm-hmm. I didn't have the internet. I didn't have psychologists and people to discuss this with until the mid 1950s, when Christine Jorgensen came across the news wires as having changed genders. And even then, I didn't have a lot at the age of 15 years old to be able to deal with these issues. And eventually, I got married, which is interesting because what I find in my work is that 97% of the people I work with aren't homosexual. They're just people who've had been affirmed or been confirmed, had confusion about their gender, or they cross-dressed as a young person and got the idea, if I'm cross-dressing, I must be transgender, which is false. So when you begin to go through this whole process and you become confused and then get married like I did and then have 2 children of your own, you're still dealing with what happened when you're a child because you haven't had proper and effective psychotherapy for someone to sit down and help you through that, which is actually abuse in my view. I call affirming somebody in a different gender child abuse. And I say that not as a spectator, but as somebody who lived through this and come out the other side and see the consequences. And I think that's a word that we don't talk much about when it comes to gender dysphoria or kids struggling with their identity, are the consequences of affirming them, consequences of giving them hormone block, consequences of teaching them that it's okay, when in fact it is not, because they're going to be deeply troubled as adults in their 30s or 40s, as I was. And so by the time I was married 17 years, still struggling with what happened by being affirmed as a young child, I went to a gender specialist, which, by the way, is probably one of the most dangerous things you can do, because they have a single-minded view of what needs to be done. They don't look at comorbidities. They don't look at child abuse as being a factor in a person struggling with their identity, when in fact it is a huge factor. Any kind of abuse, whether it's emotional or psychological, or whether the child suffered some deep loss, a broken family, or even neighborhood kids cross-dressing them and affirming them, has the same impact as a parent doing it. So when I went to this gender specialist, who happened to be the #1 expert in the world at the time, he had actually written the original Harry Benjamin International Standards of Care in 1978 and 79. His name was Dr. Walker. He said that I had gender dysphoria. They called it gender identity disorder. But even in that conversation I had, he said, it's going to become called gender dysphoria. They knew back in the 70s that it was going to change. And so he said the cure or treatment was hormone therapy and surgical gender change. And that you needed to go through a 2-year process of hormones and so forth, which I did. And at the end of 2 years, in 1983, which is 35 years ago, I underwent gender reassignment surgery in Trinidad, Colorado, and became Laura Jensen, and lived 8 years in the San Francisco, California area as Laura Jensen, working for the federal government in banking and at the Postal Service. So it wasn't until I went to UC Santa Cruz and started studying psychology, and the psychology of addictions, the psychology of what I was going through. And I came across the first study I read was from Cornell University, and it talked about separation anxiety. It gave a case study about a young person whose mother passed away, who was very close to his mother. And his mother had passed away, and he adopted this female persona. And the psychologists and psychiatrists who were dealing with him came to the conclusion that he adopted this, quote, transgender identity as a result of separation anxiety, that he felt the loss of his mother so deeply that he actually took on his mother's identity so that he didn't feel like she was gone. Mm-hmm. So when I read this, and I read it over and over again, sitting in the library, the stacks, and realizing that, gender dysphoria being diagnosed that way is actually some kind of deeper psychological disorder. And what we're not doing, I realized, was digging into what happened. And then I reflected on my own life about the sexual abuse and the affirmation. And then I went deeper and studied people who are really well known in the community, like Dr. Charles L. Ihlenfeld, who was a homosexual and a transgender activist who was, as an endocrinologist, worked for 6 years at the Harry Benjamin Clinic in New York, administered hormone therapy to 500 or more transgenders. And at the end of the 6 years, here's this homosexual activist actually working in that community, promoting hormone therapy, said that he's quitting the practice because hormone therapies and helping people, encouraging them change genders was causing way too much unhappiness, and there were too many suicides. And he said he's going into psychiatry so that he can help the people deal with the deeper issues that changing genders and giving hormones don't address. Now that, to me, that single event by that one prominent person should have changed and done a pivot point on the entire dynamics of the treatment of gender dysphoria. But it was sort of like blowing through a stop sign at an intersection. People never looked at this. It was powerful. And then we had Dr. Paul McHugh in the Myers report come later, almost nearly at the same time, months apart, came to the same kind of conclusion. So then we had two very powerful studies that show that it's ineffective. And at doing hormones and surgery is just not proving to be good because it's causing people suicides. Their lives are not really better in the long term. And then we had the great study come out of the UK in July 2004 by the University of Birmingham, who studied 100 different places that had done this work, and they collected them together. And their conclusion was sex changes are not effective, that people remain traumatized to the point of suicide after having changed gender. So we have so much information. And then in my own life, I was seeing that I was one who attempted suicide because we are not giving proper, effective therapies for the comorbidities that are causing people to not want to be who they are. And that's kind of the underlying thing. But there's a broader issue, which is that's a political issue that's pushing this agenda. Everybody's looking to the LGBT for their information, and they should be looking at the science, and they should be looking at the history of Ihlenfeld, even the studies out of the UK published by the UK Guardian. And we have a tremendous amount of studies now that are quite opposite in supporting changing genders. And so I'm writing a new book that's going to be out in about 2 weeks. I would love for you to have that book and translate it.
Yes.
And have it translated. It's a powerful book. And it's called Trans Life No More because it has stories in there about people who went through this, even young people are in the book that went through it and said how it ruined their life, that it was the biggest mistake they ever made. And that's the message that's not getting through. There is absolutely no evidence that supports changing someone's gender through hormones or surgery, that it's either effective, long-term, or helps them have a better quality of life. In fact, the opposite is true. Many of the people feel far more distressed later on. I just had a letter from somebody 3 days ago, 20 years afterward, and said, my life, I'm miserable. I have just as much gender dysphoria 20 years after changing genders as I did before. Nobody's ever offered me the psychotherapy that was effective in dealing with what caused that. Now, the person admitted they were sexually abused as a young child, but nobody ever addressed it. And I think this is a huge issue that we are just not looking at. And so that's, my story is that I get letters every single day from people who regret having done it. And I get them from teenagers. I get them from people who've done it, who did the surgery, and it was only 3 weeks after surgery, some of them 30 years after surgery. That's, for me, the message, trying to get that out has been a challenge because nobody will publish my books. I have to self-publish. And as you know, I do a lot of writing for Public Discourse and the Federalist and the Daily Signal. I try as best I can. That's why I take every opportunity when somebody invites me to talk about the subject. I'm passionate about it because I see, like Dr. Ihlenfeld did back in the late 70s, there's too much unhappiness and there's still too many suicides. They have not resolved the suicide issue by providing hormones and surgery for people who are gender distressed. And I think that speaks to the fact that we are not providing them effective, proper therapies for whatever's causing them to not want to be who they are.
Wow, yeah, very powerful testimony, Walter. And that brings up a lot of questions that I like to ask you. You mentioned, sexual abuse in your own life story, something very tragic, traumatic, and something that many people, for many different reasons, are not able to overcome without the proper help, psychological help, going through a forgiveness therapy, being able to forgive, and that manifests itself in many different ways. In your case, you went through the whole process of sex reassignment surgeries and then detransitioning back, and that's a very powerful example and story for many people to listen to. And I'm pretty sure that when you say, I get letters from a lot of people, I work with a lot of people, you refer to people in what's called the transgender community. That's right?
Right. Oh, yes. I get letters from people in the community that have lived the life who are really supportive of me. Many people think that I'm getting bad letters. I'm not. People are saying, please, because I have a lot of friends, that are suffering, and they really appreciate the work I'm doing, but it's not appreciated by people outside of the community because they think I'm a bad person. And I'm really trying to help those people who are still struggling after someone said that hormones and surgery is going to fix them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I'll go back to that. But the whole issue with activists and you as a member of a true member of what may be considered a transgender community. But before that, you mentioned sexual abuse. You also mentioned an affirmative kind of like approach, affirming your gender confusion and your perception of what you really were. In one of the dangers and what really concerns me in the whole approach of the sexual education programs in Argentina, for example, is that the only type of approach that is presented as valid is an affirmative approach, affirmative therapy that you say is destructive. What is it that went through your mind regarding your gender, and regarding you mentioned experimenting? It's not really a dysphoria, but it's just experimenting curiosity children have. And why is it that affirmative therapy, when it comes to that, is so dangerous for the child and for any other person?
Well, because anytime, as I said, anytime you affirm somebody, you're affirming actually something that isn't biologically true. And I get letters from people who later on in life realize that they were lied to, that they could never be. One of the things that comes across, I can never be a real woman. I need to detransition. There's a bigger move in people detransitioning after having changed genders today than at any other time in history, because people are beginning to use the word, I can never really be a different gender, that it's a lie. Biologically, they begin to realize that. Emotionally and psychologically, when you're trying to affirm somebody to adopt a different gender identity, you're putting tremendous amount of stress on them to adopt a different persona, a different identity, a different way of life. And so you see people mimicking behaviors. If they're a boy, mimicking girl behavior, they're not women. And so it puts a tremendous amount of stress on them. And that's why we see such huge numbers of attempted suicides among young people. So if we're continuing to conflate curiosity, it's not experimenting. I don't call it experimenting. It's just pure curiosity. We have to realize that it's adults that's driving this whole young children changing genders, not the kids. It's the adults' perception of them being transgender, when in fact, this is the only time in history when people have been affirming young children and saying they're transgender. you realize that it's only come in about the last 10 years that there's been this tremendous political push by the LGBT and others to fund this whole, and there's a power force of money going into this agenda, and they're in all areas of our political agendas, from Chile to your country, to the US, to the UK, to Canada. And Dr. Zucker actually was absolutely right in his research. He said if we don't affirm them as young people, they will grow out of it. So Dr. Zucker had it correct, but anytime you're right, and anytime you have the correct research and science, you're going to be squashed and pushed out like he was. He was absolutely 100% on the money with his research. If we used Zucker as the way to deal with these issues, we would have far less problems with young people and gender dysphoria. So he's only out, not because he was wrong, he's out because he was correct.
Right, right. And you know, many people say we are not against a good type of sexual education as long as it is based on science. And what
Right.
psychiatry has taught us, what studies like Dr. Zucker, who is one of the most renowned psychiatrists when it comes to transgender issues in the world. And if he was shut down, then what is left for people like me or so many other, specialists or scientists that are trying to grapple with this idea and trying to bring up the truth of the matter. So here we see that there is a political motivation behind that. And I like to talk more about that. You mentioned the activists and the LGBT radical, proponents, and many of them, in the first place, they call themselves we represent the transgender community, when they've never been chosen by anybody.
No.
If there is someone that represents the transgender community, it's you. And every person that is going through this drama and problem that is very personal, very unique.
Yes.
But here we don't have a kind of, democratic process by which we say these activists will represent, they will be the voice of the community. They just take that position. They claim that for themselves. And something that I find interesting is that many of these activists are not even transgender people. They are radical feminists trying to impose their own philosophy, their own views, their own anger against biology. Many of them talk about the tyranny of biology, and I think they see the transgender issue as something that fits their own rhetoric, and that's why they push this philosophy, this worldview onto science, and sadly so many psychiatrists and doctors and psychologists now that are being in a way molded according to that philosophy that has nothing to do with science or the medical field. Now in Argentina, for example, someone sent me an email telling me that they've opened a new field which is called gender psychologist. So now we have a host of psychologists coming out of universities where the only approach they've been taught is to do affirmative therapy. Right. And you can imagine the amount of destruction and the many lives they are going to ruin unless they are honest about their own field, about their knowledge and their science, and deepen more into the reality of what it is to suffer, in the case of people that do suffer some kind of gender dysphoria, or cases like you mentioned where there's just a curiosity, and as soon as that curiosity is expressed by the child, I got a letter, vicious letter attacking me from a teacher in Argentina. Why you are talking against children's rights? And she said, you are fighting against human rights because children have a right to express themselves in different genders, and they have a right to be affirmed on that, right? So they give the child this power to decide what should be done, even in their own lives. In many cases that you probably know, they ask the child, what do you want to do? Do you want to do hormonal blockers now? And we are talking about children as young as 8, right? Shall we do it in different shots every month? Shall we do it in an implant on your arm? And the parents trying to protect the child in a way that is really harmful. And as you said, this is sexual. I mean, this is a kind of abuse.
Yeah, it is abuse. And what we're missing from this discussion is that children do not have enough development in their brain to understand consequences and understand what's actually going to happen in their life until they're between the ages of 18 and 20. That's when the brain is developed. We're looking at children at 8 years old, in this case that you mentioned, as though they're adults and that they can understand what they're doing. They don't. You know, they have no idea what's going to happen to them. And the only thing that's going to happen to them is they're going to contact somebody like me later in life and say, I'm now 28 years old. I changed genders when I was 15. Can you help me detransition? Now they can't produce children. Their lives have been virtually destroyed, and they're asking me to try to put their life back together. So it appears to me that people have no really caring heart for the long-term consequences of what they're doing to young children. It's abhorrent. It is just beyond my comprehension that adults would be pushing children into this gender change ideology because they think that the children are adult enough to do it, when in fact there is absolutely no science or proof that they have the capability of understanding what consequences are about to come their way in their 30s and 20s and so forth from doing this.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's very, very sad and very dramatic. This is something that we should really be talking about, because this is an issue really of human health that is not being attended to. One of the things that I read in the book that published by Ryan Anderson, he said, if your child says he's a dog, are you going to give your child dog food? Right?
Yeah.
So this is an issue of common sense, basically.
Absolutely.
But here we have the media, we have the whole public education system, we have government and politicians and activists trying to push an idea that is, for me, sometimes it's hard to understand how such a huge sector of the population might have fallen into this delusion, right? To think that, yes, you might have been born in the wrong body, that lack of perception of reality, of the real, when biology and science and endocrinology tells us the contrary. You said that during the whole process after the surgery, you had to go to, get hormones, and from what I've read and studied, in women it's even worse, because in women it's very hard to find a balance. It depends on the climate, the weather, the mood, their weight, and they really mess their lives up completely.
Yes, absolutely. And I get letters from the female to male gals who want me to help them detransition back as well. And it's just what we have here is a huge power structure of money pushing this as a political agenda to force people into this ideology that it has never proven to be effective. Mm-hmm. And I wrote an article in the Public Discourse, 50 years of mental disorders and suicides, I believe it is, that has both Ihlenfeld's perspective and McHugh's perspective, and I put the two together. And because the evidence and the facts and the results and the history have been there for 50 years, and nobody is willing to raise them up. And you're getting bad letters. People come after me. What they do is they squash us like they did Zucker. They don't want these voices, the voice that you hear right now. They don't want people to hear that because it's the truth. They're being paid. The activists are being paid. They're paid people. They're on a salary. I'm not.
That's right. Same here. And this is the thing. We here we have people that are working full time to push an agenda. There is money coming from a lot of places, and therefore they become very efficient in their enterprise, right? They are like the apostles being sent to conquer the world and preach this whole gender ideology and agenda and the LGBT rights, and they as you know, they don't just target education, they target everything, every realm. The church, they target schools, they target universities, they target the workforce. You talk about money coming in from a lot of places, and we are talking about tons of money. In the case of Canada, for example, I know that you talk about money coming in from a lot of places, and we are talking about tons of money. In the case of Canada, for example, I know that you can look at the public records and statements. The Canadian government donated $650 million for the battle of women's rights. But when you look at it and where the money went to, it's all activists, it's all organizations that push for gender ideology, they push for sex ed, and a lot of that money went to Argentina, those $650 million. And why is that? Because in Argentina, they were debating two things: abortion and sex education in schools, but a more comprehensive sexual education centered on affirmative therapy and approach. So we see here the two things are hand by hand. What many people don't know is that, basically feminists have organized a revolution against the tyranny of biology. And one of the problems, right, that they found is that women happen to not just conceive a child, but carry the child for 9 months. So they want to have control over that. That's why the abortion was one of their main goals. But then also transgender issues, because a transgender issue, in a way, they say, it proves the fact that there is a distinction between your biological sex and your gender. And by identifying yourself as a transsexual, lesbian, or whatever it may be, then you constitute yourself, your new identity. So they talk about identities, right? And this is now the new vocabulary being forced upon the population in Argentina. We have to talk about identities as if they were separate essences, and you constitute yourself in that identity. If you prevent someone, a child, from pursuing that identity, then you are violating their own humanity. It's a crime against human rights. And in Argentina, it's very, very interesting that the people that are pushing for this kind of rights, and they have formed their own human rights commissions, is the same people, if you look at the life story, that were involved in communist guerrilla in Latin America back in the 70s. So this is people that went on placing bombs and killing people and proclaiming the revolution. And now these same people are the radical feminists, even though many of them are men, but we have both men and women. Yeah. And here we see the connection. If you look at it from a philosophical perspective, the connection between Marxist ideology and feminist and LGBT ideology. How have they borrowed from this very dangerous ideology that has murdered more than 100 million people in the world in the 20th century, the most murderous ideology that we've ever seen in humanity. And we see, going back to the money, I get that question a lot. Yeah. Where is the money coming from? What is your opinion on that?
Well, yeah, George Soros is one of the key players, but there's others. There's a gentleman here in the U.S., I've forgotten his name now, but he has just in the last few months or a couple of years spent $400 million of his own money to advocate and push for transgender and LGBT rights. So one person, $400 million, but there are probably 30 men and women in the United States that are pushing these agendas through finances to get laws changed. And the real agenda is to crush the gender norms and to crush anything that is remotely resembles science. And so Isn't it interesting? I think the most interesting thing is the days since Adam and Eve, everyone until 50 years ago knew what gender they were. It was never a question. It was never an issue, except for rare occasions did it come up. Now we have a whole society across the world that's going, gee, what gender am I? You know, it's just beyond our comprehension to understand how much money, I call it dark money, that has gone into persuading people to alter their children. And they're really taking over families with this gender identity and pushing them into something that is very harmful. I'm here to attest to the fact that affirming somebody in a different gender is a lifelong, destructive, abhorrent process that no one should ever do. Again, it isn't similar to abuse. It is child abuse, and it should be eradicated and not done. We should sit down with children and say, why do you feel this way? Where did you get this idea? Because many of them are getting it in the schools. Many of them are getting it off of the internet, or they're getting it from a friend. If we took this entire gender ideology out of society, it would go away. The problem is that they're filling us with it. They're driving it through television. They're driving it through media, where we have created something that actually only exists as an idea. It isn't real. There's no biological basis. It has no one can actually show, oh, that's a transgender, I'll show you, and provide medical proof. It doesn't exist. It only exists in our minds, and therefore it's a psychological, emotional, or sexual issue, not that of science.
That's right. And when I promote my courses that I offer online, and hundreds of people have taken them, and I believe they profit a lot from this, and they learn so much from different studies that have been done, all over the world. And I do receive a lot of attacks from activists because they're not happy with one thing. I call it gender ideology, and they're not happy with the word ideology.
Right. Yeah.
And that's something they will never accept, and that's something that makes them furious. And they even send me letters saying you have to take that word down, and I say I will not, because here we are talking about an ideology. And they tell me, well, you and your religious dogmatism. And I say, well, in my courses I never mention anything religious. I never base any argument on whatever the Bible or any other religious book might say. I do sometimes quote verses that I think they have a very strong scientific foundation. For example, in psychiatry, the truth will set you free. That's, when you forgive 70 times 7, like Jesus said. Well, that's a principle in psychiatry. It's been proven, right, that forgiveness is the path to overcome so many traumas from childhood and abuse, and because the truth is life is suffering, right? And unless you find meaning for your life, it will be empty, right? And so these people say, don't bring your religious dogmatism into the question. And I say, actually, no religious content at all. On purpose, I do that. I just go from a purely philosophical perspective, because this is an ideological debate. So we can't live, the whole foundation here is a worldview, a philosophical worldview, a Gnostic worldview, as many say. And then we have to bring in all of the sciences. Right. With honesty, all of them, with honesty, even if some of the findings of the science might not agree with a belief that I had. Well, we have to be open to that, because science will never contradict the truth if it's carried out in an honest and sincere way. And something that I say a lot in my classes, that many times scientists that replicate findings, done by Dr. Zucker and so many others, they were trying to prove them wrong, right? And then they replicated the fact, like 41% of transgender people commit suicide. Someone said, no, that's not possible. They are better after. They are happier. They say they're happy, and then, oh wow, there you go, surprised. Sometimes it's even worse because it's as you say, through social media, through the media, through politicians and laws. It's going to be worse. Sadly, it's going to be worse than what's been till now. And one of the things I tell them is, look, you tell me religious dogmatism. No, I don't do any religious approach for my courses, my explanation of what's going on. However, I bring in science.
Yeah.
Because if what I say does not align with science, then here we have a kind of dogmatism. And this is what you are saying. And this is what I wanted to tell you, Walter. In Argentina, there's a city, La Plata, a big city near Buenos Aires. And one of the teachers, very concerned, sent me a letter and said, during class, these activists came in the name of the government to explain sex ed and the new curriculum. They had all the students sit at the big hall, and they said, and this is interesting, Walter, I want you to hear this. They said, science, and they were very honest about that, science and biology and molecular genetics, and yes, they haven't proven that there is such a thing as a gender, the sciences, but here what we are bringing in is social sciences, and the social sciences is a proof that our humanity is in a process of evolution, and therefore now this is a higher stage. We have the sciences here, social sciences are above, and therefore what we are telling you is the latest, right?
Yeah.
And such a contradiction in there, because the same people that accuse religion, for example, this is the hypocrisy of being against science, and there is, we can't do science because there is religion, but the same people are the ones saying, no, we are above science.
Yeah. Well, I think what I'll be interested in seeing is if the governments who are pushing this on young children, this ideology on young children and on families, and convincing parents that they need to go through this hormonal and sometimes surgical change, are they willing to spend the money then to help them detransition? Are they willing to pay for the burials of the suicides? Are they willing to compensate the families $1 million each for the death of their children because it didn't work? Is the governments that are pushing this willing to accept responsibility and pay the cost for detransitions and for the deaths of these young people and adults as well? And that's really what's at stake here. They themselves, the governments, are unwilling to take any responsibility for this. And that's also true for the people pushing the agenda. So, I'm glad I had an opportunity to speak with you, and I hope you can stay in touch.
Oh, yes, we will.
And, I'll make my book available to you if you can get it. Somehow we'll work that out so that it can be published perhaps where you are. It's an unbelievable, it's going to be a pivotal book in this whole arena of transgenderism, because it has the kids portion, it has adults in it, it has the research. It is the most complete book of its kind to this date, and I'm excited about it. So like I say, it's a great opportunity to talk with you. I hope we can continue this relationship. I'd love to come to Argentina when we can get somebody to fund it. But so thank you so much for having me on.
Great. Thank you so much, Walter. Your book sounds amazing, especially because you come from the transgender side, and the work that you are doing, helping people, has no price. And it's really a blessing for everyone, even for many of us that never had to go through such a traumatic experience. But seeing your testimony really confirms what we've been studying, and in my case, in the philosophy world, fighting and arguing with people that you say, what's going on here? Why this delusion? And then you come in, and then you are really a blessing.
Yeah, so are you, Pablo. It's nice to see somebody young. I'll be 78 in just a little over a week. So I need the young people to come in behind me and carry the torch to try to.
Jordan Peterson once he told me, and the work that you are doing, helping people, has no price, and it's really a blessing for everyone, even for for many of us that never had to go through such a traumatic experience. But seeing your testimony really confirms what we've been studying, and in my case, in the philosophy world, fighting and arguing with people that you say, what's going on here? Why this delusion? And then you come in, and then you are really a blessing.
Yeah, so are you, Pablo. It's nice to see somebody young. I'll be 78 in just a little over a week. So I need the young people to come in behind me and carry the torch to try to.
Well,
Pablo, thank you so much.
Thank you. And then I look forward to the book, and then we'll keep in touch. I look forward to translating the book, and I'm sure, many people have been thinking about organizing a tour all over Argentina to talk about these issues. And I'll be more than happy that you come along with me, and
I would love to.
Interpreter, because you are a really powerful example, and we have to stop this. Even if they make it legal, we have to stop this. We have to do whatever it takes because many lives are being damaged, and sometimes forever, right? And here we're crossing the line, and this is unforgivable. This is criminal, what's going on.
Yes, it is. So send me your address. I'll make sure you get a book.
Right. Thank you, Walter, and have a great weekend.
Yeah.
Enjoy, and God bless you for all the work you do.
Thank you, and likewise, Pablo.
Bye-bye.